Good morning, church. For this Sunday school, I'll be covering chapter 17 of the Lordship of Christ book. And for the past couple chapters, we have been covering how the Lordship of Christ affects different areas of our lives. In other words, go back to the saying that we say in our church, which is all of Christ for all of life. But we're not perfect. Eventually we will fail. And so for the next couple chapters, starting with this one, we'll be looking at different traps that we may fall into when trying to honor the Lordship of Christ. And the first trap is probably the most dangerous, which is pride. J.C. Ryle says, quote, "Pride is the oldest and most common sin," unquote. And so in one sense, every sin has pride in its roots. When we sin, we are saying to God that my judgment is better than his. Look to Adam and Eve, right? With the help of the devil, right? They thought that they knew better when they sinned. But if we are serious about the Lordship of Christ in every area of our life, then we must serve him above ourselves. Galatians 2:20, which I'll cover a little bit later, shows us that even our pride must be crucified. Now let's look at a couple passages that deal with pride. The first one being Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 to 26. And it says, "Then Jesus told his disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul?'" So this passage is talking about how Jesus is calling us to deny ourselves, including our life, for his sake. And we can't do this if our hearts are full of pride. The next passage, let's look at the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And that's Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. And it says, "He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I get.' But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his chest, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.' I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted." So this parable serves as a great reminder that pride can creep in unnoticed. And so we can easily, as believers, even become like the Pharisee. We can say things like, I'm serving the Lord in many ways. I am doing all these things. We could even list the stuff that the Pharisee said and say, "Look at me, Lord. I'm not like those lazy Christians over there that are not doing anything for your glory." And so now let's look at verses that can help us for overcoming pride. And the first one is Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. And it says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." So this is telling us that if your mind is set on the heavenly things and you understand that your salvation is now in Christ, right? Your safety is in Christ, then there'll be no room for pride. And the next one that I mentioned earlier in Galatians 2:20 says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So this is telling us that now Christ lives through you, right? So clothe yourselves with humility and not with pride. And the last passage is Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 to 4. And it says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. So in this passage, I want you to understand this type of humility that Christ has. And if your mentality is the same, then if you seek to have this humility and do it for his glory and his glory alone, then pride will be very difficult to have in your life. So the next trap that we're going to look at is despair. And this can be the opposite problem of pride. We sometimes despair when we think we cannot accomplish anything significant for the glory of Christ. Right? We wallow in our past and our failures and our shortcomings and think everything is just bad. Like, woe is me, I can't do anything good for his glory. But pride can be hiding underneath all that because we're acting like we have no motivation to do anything unless it'll be something amazing, something extraordinary that'll make us look good. So just like pride, the key to destroying despair is humility. So again, clothe yourselves with humility, and you will joyfully serve the Lord. Right? He has forgiven everything from your past. So there's no need to even think about your failures, your shortcomings, any of that, right? So we could even look at things that are mundane, things that you might not think bring him glory, but like we've said in the previous video, and Martin has told us before that whatever you do, if it's in the Lord, your labor will not be in vain. So there's no need to look for the incredible, extraordinary thing that will bring him the most glory. No, wherever the Lord has called you, do it to his glory. And so the last trap we're going to look at is the fear of man. And of course, this greatly interferes with trying to serve Christ, trying to bring his lordship to every area of our lives. And so the opposite of this will be to fear God instead. If you look to Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, and it says, and do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Right? So if you're truly in fellowship with God, then you will care for what he thinks. And what he has to say far outweighs any human opinion. So don't fear man, fear God instead. And of course, these are just a few traps that we can fall into as we seek to serve Christ and honor him as Lord over all. So keep in mind that these traps can be subtle and be very difficult to bring into light, including pride. So to avoid these traps, clothe yourselves with humility and keep your eyes fixed on Christ and him alone.